The notice went up at sunrise on the courthouse wall, and it wasn't a punishment. It was a death sentence. Most folks in Prosperity Creek just saw the ink. They saw the judge's bold, angry signature. They saw the name of his daughter, Charlotte May Whitmore, age 19, offered up to the first unmarried man who'd have her. Beggar, drunkard, servant, it didn't matter. Her father, the most powerful man in the Wyoming Territory, was going to bring his proud daughter low. That's the story they told each other over grits and coffee. That's the story they'd tell their grandchildren. But they didn't know the real story. They didn't see the invisible ink between the lines. They didn't understand that Judge Harrison Whitmore wasn't breaking his daughter. He was trying, in the only way he had left, to save her life. And only two other people in the whole world knew it. One of them was Charlotte. The other was the man who was coming to claim her. Charlotte stood at her bedroom window that morning, not shaking with fear, but with a cold, hard rage. The dust on the main street looked like smoke from a battlefield. She had said no to Samuel Hartley. She had said it in the parlor, with his smirking father and her own shell-shocked mother watching. She had refused the wealthiest rancher's son in the territory, and in doing so, she had signed her own death warrant. Or so Samuel thought. Her father had cornered her the night before, his face not cruel but terrified. "He will not stop," the judge had whispered, his hands trembling. "His family owns every loan, every deed, every soul in this town. They want our land, Charlotte. Refusing him was like spitting in a king's face. He will ruin you, or worse." So they had hatched a plan, a desperate, insane plan that would make her a pariah, but might just keep her breathing. The notice was the first move. "Put on your blue silk," her mother said, her voice hollow. Appearances, always appearances. But Charlotte didn't touch the silk. She chose a plain gray dress, the color of ash, and tied her hair with a single ribbon. She wasn't a doll for auction. She was a soldier going to war. The men who came in the following days were a sick parade, drifters with snake oil smiles sent by Samuel to mock her. Old ranch hands with hungry eyes paid $1 to play their part. Her father turned them all away with a show of cold disgust, playing his role to perfection. He was waiting. They were both waiting. Every rejection was a signal, a message sent out into the prairie on the wind. A message that said, "Not him, not him, not him." On the seventh day, the final day, the church bell rang. The sound cut through the cold air like a blade. Charlotte walked up the church steps, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. The pews were mostly empty, save for a few town gossips hoping for a good show. Her father stood in the front row, a statue of paternal fury. It was a magnificent performance. And at the altar a man waited. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a ranch hand. He was the man from the livery, the one who moved with a quiet purpose, whose hands were as steady as the granite hills. Dark hair, broad shoulders, and a coat that was too small, as if he'd outgrown it long ago. When he turned his head, his eyes met hers. They were the color of a pine forest after a hard rain, and in those eyes she saw it, a flicker of recognition, the answer to their desperate prayer. The minister, Reverend Walsh, cleared his throat, his face a mask of disapproval. "Thomas Beckett," he announced, the name sounding foreign in the silent church. "Stable hand, unmarried." He turned to the man. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Thomas said. The voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a deep creek bed. It was a voice that held more weight than a simple stable hand should possess. Then all eyes were on her. "Charlotte May Whitmore, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" She could feel her father's stare, a silent, desperate command. She could feel the weight of the town's judgment. She looked at Thomas Beckett, at this complete stranger who was her only hope. There was no triumph in his face, no smirk, just a calm, steady resolve. He was here to do a job. "I do," she whispered, the words tasting like freedom and chains all at once. "You may kiss your bride." Thomas didn't move for her lips. He took her gloved hand and pressed a light, formal kiss to her knuckles. It wasn't the touch of a lover. It was the touch of an ally, a signal. The plan is in motion. Her father strode forward and signed the marriage certificate with a flourish. his hand perfectly steady. He pulled a small, heavy leather purse from his coat and pressed it into Thomas's hand. It looked like a dowry, a pittance, an insult. "That is her dowry," the judge said, his voice ringing with contempt. "Such as it is, she is your charge now. Keep her in line." It was the most important line of the whole play. Keep her in line. Thomas's jaw tightened. He looked at the judge, a flicker of something ancient and dangerous in his green eyes. "Yes, sir," he said, and the words were a vow. He wasn't talking about obedience. He was talking about protection. He didn't look at the judge again. He was her husband now, her protector. The judge had just passed the torch. They stepped out into the harsh sunlight, man and wife. The air felt colder. A rattling wagon was hitched to a mule with one good ear. Her trunks, the few things she was allowed to bring, were already loaded. Her father, the master planner, had thought of everything. As Thomas helped her onto the hard wooden seat, she saw Samuel Hartley across the street, leaning against a post. He wasn't smiling. He was watching them, his eyes narrowed slits of pure hatred. He had been outplayed, for now. But he knew, and she knew, this was just the beginning. The game had just been moved to a new board. The wagon creaked as it rolled out of town, leaving Prosperity Creek behind. The road stretched out into the vast, empty prairie. For a long time, there was only the sound of the wheels in the wind. Charlotte stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice quiet, steady. "It is not far," he said. "The roof holds. The well is sweet." He paused, then added a detail that seemed oddly specific. "And the door has a good, strong lock." She turned to look at him then. He wasn't making small talk. He was giving a report. He was telling her she was being taken to a safe house. The cabin was small, weathered, but it stood on a slight rise, giving a clear view of the surrounding land. A fortress. Inside it was scrubbed clean. A table, 2 chairs, a stove, a curtain separating a small bedroom, a ladder leading to a loft. Simple, defensible. Thomas carried her trunk inside and set it down carefully. "The bedroom is there," he said, his eyes on the floorboards. "I'll sleep in the loft." "We're married," she said, testing him, testing the boundaries of this strange new alliance. "By law," he agreed, finally meeting her eyes. "But I do not take what is not freely given. My job is to keep you safe, Miss Whitmore. Nothing more." He still called her Miss Whitmore. He went back outside to tend to the mule, leaving her alone in the small, quiet space. She walked to the window and looked out. The prairie was a vast, dangerous ocean, and this little cabin was a lifeboat. She opened the small purse her father had given Thomas. It wasn't filled with coins. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a single ornate iron key, and beneath it, a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was her father's. "He doesn't know what's on the land. He only suspects. The evidence is in the Union Bank box in Cheyenne. This key is your life. Trust Beckett. Burn this." Charlotte carried the note to the stove. She fed it to the hungry flames, watching the judge's words turn to black ash. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about her, it was about everything. And she was standing in a tiny wooden cabin with a stranger who held her life in his hands. That night, as the coyotes howled, she didn't feel fear. She felt the cold, sharp edge of purpose. The real war had just begun. Morning came with the smell of coffee and a plate of biscuits left on the table. Beside it was a note written in slow, careful letters. "At stable. Back by noon. Eggs in basket. Lock the door." The last 3 words were underlined twice. She ate on the porch, watching the endless grass ripple under the wind. The silence was immense. In her father's house, there was always the ticking of a grandfather clock, the rustle of a servant's apron. Here there was only the wind and the cry of a distant hawk. It was the sound of isolation, the sound of safety. She spent the morning exploring the cabin. It was more than a home, it was a fortification. The windows had thick wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. The floorboards by the hearth were newer than the rest, a different color wood. She knelt, her fingers tracing the seams. A trap door, a hiding place. Thomas was more than he seemed. Far more. He returned at noon, hay in his hair, and the scent of the stables on his coat. He didn't talk about his day. He simply washed at the pump and prepared a simple meal of bread and salted pork. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that was both reassuring and unnerving. This was a man who wasted nothing. Not words, not movements, not time. As they ate in silence, he finally broke it. "Your father said you were smart," he said, not looking at her. "He said you could read and write proper." "I can," she replied, her guard up. He pushed a small battered primer across the table. It was a child's reading book. "I can spell my name, and a few other things. But papers, contracts, I need to know what they say before I sign." He finally lifted his gaze, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes was disarming. "If you would teach me, I could pay you. With work." It was a test. She knew it instantly. He was gauging her, trying to see if the judge's proud daughter was still in there. The one who would scoff at teaching a stable hand his letters. He was asking if she was a partner, or just cargo he had to protect. She looked at his hands, calloused and strong. She looked at the neat mends in his coat, the way he had carefully arranged wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. He was trying to make this prison a home for her. A steady warmth bloomed in her chest, the first she'd felt in months. "I will teach you," she said, her voice clear and even. "And you owe me nothing for it. We're in this together." A smile touched his lips, and it transformed his entire face, like the sun breaking through a week of storm clouds. "Good," he said, "because there's something else you need to learn." He stood and walked to the wall, where a long, heavy object, wrapped in oilcloth, was hanging from two pegs. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a rifle. A Winchester, long and sleek and deadly. He laid it on the table between them. The polished wood gleamed in the lamplight. "Reading is important," Thomas said, his voice dropping low, all trace of the clumsy student gone. "But out here, knowing how to use this is more important. Your lessons will be in the morning. Mine will be in the afternoon. School starts tomorrow." Charlotte stared at the rifle, then back at the quiet man who was her husband. The stable hand who couldn't read, but could strip and clean a firearm with the ease of a master. Her father hadn't just found her a guard. He'd found her a soldier. And he expected her to become one too. The days fell into a new rhythm. In the mornings, she taught him letters. "A is for apple," she'd write on the small slate. "A is for ambush," he'd say, without a trace of a smile, and she would feel a chill run down her spine. He was a quick learner, his mind sharp and hungry. He wasn't just learning to read. He was studying, analyzing, searching for something. In the afternoons, he took her outside. He taught her how to hold the Winchester, how to brace it against her shoulder to absorb the kick, how to breathe out slow before squeezing the trigger, how to lead a moving target. Her arms ached, her shoulder bruised, but she never complained. With each shot that rang out across the prairie, she felt a piece of the old Charlotte, the judge's fragile daughter, dying, and someone new, someone harder, being born in her place. He taught her other things too. How to read the land. How a broken twig could tell you who had passed by. How the silence of the birds could signal danger long before you saw it. He was teaching her how to survive. One afternoon, as she was cleaning the rifle, a question that had been burning in her finally broke free. "Who are you, Thomas?" He stopped what he was doing, his back to her. "I'm the man the judge sent to keep you safe." "You're no stable hand," she pressed. "Stable hands don't know how to fight like you do. They don't know how to turn a cabin into a fortress." He turned around slowly, his face unreadable. He walked to his bedroll in the corner and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a soft, metallic clink. Charlotte opened it. Inside was a silver star, tarnished with age, a U.S. Marshal's badge. "My name isn't Thomas Beckett," he said quietly. "It's Joshua Kane. I was a marshal. Rode with your father back when he was a circuit judge, before he put on the fancy robes. We cleaned up a lot of messes together." Her mind reeled. Her father, the stern, proper Judge Whitmore, a frontier lawman. It seemed impossible. "What happened?" she asked. "The Hartley family happened," he said, his voice turning to gravel. They weren't just ranchers then. They ran guns, smuggled whiskey, everything. We had a case built against them, solid as stone. But someone on the inside talked. They set up an ambush. My partner was killed. I was wounded, left for dead. He unconsciously touched a long, thin scar near his temple. The evidence vanished. The Hartleys walked free, bought their way into legitimacy. I buried my name, took a job in a livery, and waited. I've been waiting for 10 years. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The notice, the coded message. Her father hadn't just picked a random man. He had called in the one man he knew who had a personal score to settle with the Hartleys. The one man who would die before letting them get to her. He trusts you, she breathed. He trusts that I hate Samuel Hartley more than any man alive. Joshua corrected her. And he's right. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. He wasn't her husband. He was her bodyguard, a ghost from her father's past. And their pretend marriage was a shield in a war that had started long before she was born. A war that was about to find its way to their doorstep. A few days later, they needed supplies. It was a risk, but a necessary one. They rode into Prosperity Creek, the rattling wagon a poor disguise for the tension that sat between them like a third passenger. Joshua, she couldn't think of him as Thomas anymore, kept one hand resting near the pistol hidden under his coat. The town was different. The whispers that had followed her before were gone, replaced by hard, cold stares. The Hartleys had tightened their grip. People were afraid to even look at her. In the mercantile, the clerk's hands shook as he measured out flour. He wouldn't meet her eyes. As they stepped back outside, Samuel Hartley was waiting for them. He wasn't alone this time. Two hard-faced men stood with him, their hands on their holsters. "Mrs. Beckett," Samuel drawled, his smile a venomous slash. "Enjoying your honeymoon cabin? I hear it's rustic." "Good afternoon, Mr. Hartley," Charlotte said, her voice steady, just as Joshua had coached her. "Never show fear." "I think you have something that belongs to my family," Samuel said, his eyes flicking to the small leather satchel where Charlotte carried their money and the key. He didn't know for sure what he was looking for, but he knew they had something. "I think you're mistaken," Joshua said, his voice deceptively mild. He stepped slightly in front of Charlotte, his body shielding hers. Samuel's smile vanished. "I don't like being told I'm mistaken, stable boy. I own this town. I own everyone in it. And I will have what is mine." He nodded to his men. It happened so fast Charlotte almost didn't see it. One of the men reached for his gun, but before his fingers could even touch the handle, Joshua moved. It wasn't a panicked motion. It was a fluid, practiced dance of violence. His hand blurred, the pistol appearing in it like a magic trick. There was a single deafening crack. The man grunted, his hand flying to his shoulder, where a dark red stain was already blossoming on his shirt. He hadn't been killed. He'd been disarmed with surgical precision. The second man froze, his hand hovering over his gun. Joshua's pistol was now aimed squarely at his chest. "I wouldn't," Joshua said, his voice a low growl that promised death. Samuel Hartley stared, his arrogant smirk replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He was looking at Joshua, but he wasn't seeing a stable hand anymore. He was seeing a predator. "This isn't over," Samuel hissed, his bravado returning, thin and brittle. "It will be," Joshua said. "Now get out of my way." They backed away slowly, dragging their wounded friend with them. Samuel's eyes never left Joshua's face, burning with a new kind of hatred, a hatred mixed with the one thing he had never felt before: fear. As they rode out of town, Charlotte's hands were shaking. The gunshots still rang in her ears. "They'll be back," she said, her voice a thin whisper. "I know," Joshua replied, his eyes scanning the horizon, already planning, already preparing for the next move. Tonight, they'll wait for dark. The sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and red. It looked like a warning. They didn't light a lamp. Darkness was their ally now. Joshua barred the door and the window shutters, plunging the cabin into near-total blackness. He handed Charlotte a pistol and a box of cartridges. "You'll stay by the hearth behind the table," he instructed, his voice a low, calm whisper. "Don't fire unless they get through the door, and don't stop firing until you're out of bullets or they're all down. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The cold, heavy weight of the pistol in her hand was terrifyingly real. This was it. The lessons were over. They waited in the suffocating silence. Every creak of the cabin walls, every gust of wind, sounded like an approaching footstep. Hours crawled by. Charlotte's muscles ached from the tension. Then a new sound. The soft, crunching sound of boots on dry grass, coming from multiple directions. They were surrounding the cabin. A voice called out from the darkness. It was Samuel. "Whitmore's girl. We know you're in there. Send her out, stable boy, and we might let you live." Joshua didn't answer. He stood by the wall next to the door, his Winchester held at the ready, a silent shadow in the gloom. There was a pause, then another shout from Samuel. "Fine! Have it your way! Burn them out!" Charlotte's blood ran cold. She heard a clinking sound, then saw a flickering orange light appear through a crack in the window shutter. A torch. They were going to set the cabin on fire. Suddenly, Joshua moved. He wasn't aiming at the window. He lifted his rifle and fired straight up through the roof. The shot was deafening in the small space. Outside, there was a surprised yelp, a thud, and the sound of the torch clattering to the ground. He'd shot the man on the roof. "He's a damn ghost!" someone yelled from the darkness. Then the assault began. A heavy object slammed against the door, making the whole cabin shake. They were using a log as a battering ram. Thud, thud, thud. The wood groaned, splintering. "Get ready," Joshua breathed. The door burst open with a crack of splintering wood. A dark shape lunged through the doorway. Joshua fired. The man fell. Another figure appeared behind him. Joshua fired again. A second man went down. But there were more. A third man scrambled over his fallen comrades, a pistol firing wildly into the darkness of the cabin. A bullet whizzed past Charlotte's ear, so close she could feel its heat. She dropped to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. Joshua grunted in pain. He'd been hit. He staggered back, trying to reload the Winchester. The man in the doorway saw his chance. He raised his pistol, aiming it straight at Joshua's chest. Charlotte didn't think. She reacted, just like he had taught her. Breathe out, squeeze. She raised her pistol, aimed at the dark silhouette, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the explosion ripping through the night. The man in the doorway stiffened, a look of pure shock on his face, before crumpling to the ground. Silence. The only sound was the ragged gasps of their own breathing. "Joshua," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm here," he rasped. "Arm. It's just my arm." They waited, listening, but there were no more footsteps, no more voices, only the sound of the wind and the distant cry of a coyote. They had won. They had survived the night. But as the first light of dawn crept through the shattered doorway, it revealed a new horror. Lying in the dirt just outside the cabin, alongside his fallen men, was Samuel Hartley. He was dead. Joshua's last shot had found its mark. They had just killed the son of the most powerful man in the territory. This was no longer a secret war. They hadn't just won a battle, they had started an inferno, and the whole of Prosperity Creek was about to burn. There was no time to think, no time to grieve or feel fear. There was only action. "We have to go," Joshua said through gritted teeth as Charlotte tore a strip from her petticoat to bandage his bleeding arm. "Now, Hartley will have the whole territory hunting us by noon." "Go where?" she asked, her hands shaking as she tied the knot. "Cheyenne," he said. "To the bank. That key is our only play now. The evidence is everything." They didn't even take the wagon. It was too slow, too conspicuous. Joshua saddled the mule for her and took the best horse from the livery, a rangy Appaloosa he had clearly been saving for this. He packed light, guns, ammunition, water, and the small bit of hardtack and dried meat they had left. As she climbed onto the mule, her eyes fell on the primer, the child's reading book, lying on the floor of the ravaged cabin. It looked so innocent, so out of place amidst the destruction. She hesitated. "Leave it," Joshua commanded. "There's no time." But something made her run back inside. She grabbed the book and stuffed it into her satchel. It felt like the only piece of their strange, quiet life that was left. They rode hard, pushing east, away from the rising sun. The prairie was a vast, unforgiving expanse. There was no cover, no place to hide. They were two small figures against an endless horizon, and she knew that somewhere behind them, a posse was forming. By midday, the heat was suffocating. Joshua's face was pale, and a line of sweat beaded on his upper lip. His wound was worse than he'd let on. He was losing blood, and his strength was failing. "We have to rest," she said, pulling the mule to a halt. "No," he insisted. "Keep moving." "You'll fall out of the saddle, Joshua. We'll find water, rest for an hour. Then we move." Her voice had a new authority, one forged in gunpowder and fear. He looked at her, and for the first time he didn't argue. They found a small, sheltered arroyo, a deep scar in the earth that offered a sliver of shade and a trickle of muddy water. As the animals drank, Charlotte cleaned and redressed Joshua's wound. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his upper arm, but it was ragged and bleeding freely. He was getting feverish. While he rested with his eyes closed, she took out the primer. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it. She flipped through the simple pages. A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for cat. It was all so normal. Then she saw it. On the page for the letter J, a faint pencil marking, a tiny dot under the first letter of the word judge. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned the page. Another dot, under the first letter of the word union. Page after page, she found them. Tiny, almost invisible dots under specific letters. JUDGEHASEVIDENCE. It was a code. A simple one, but a code nonetheless. Someone had used this primer to pass a message. But who? She kept flipping, her fingers flying through the pages. The coded message continued, HARTLEYMURDERMARSHALWADE. Marshall Wade. That was the name of Joshua's partner, the one who had been killed in the ambush 10 years ago. Her blood ran cold. This book, this wasn't just any primer. She raced to the last page, the inside back cover. There, tucked into a small slit in the leather binding, was a thin folded piece of paper, an official-looking document. It was a sworn affidavit. She read the words, her eyes widening in horror and disbelief. It was a confession, written and signed by a man named Caleb Patterson, the town blacksmith. The affidavit told the whole story, how Caleb, deep in debt to the Hartley family, had been forced to pass information to them about the Marshall's investigation, how he had told them the route Marshall Kane and Marshall Wade would be taking. It was his information that had led to the ambush, to the murder of Joshua's partner. This primer wasn't a school book. It was the missing evidence, the original evidence. The judge hadn't just sent Joshua a key. He had sent him the entire case. He had hidden it in the one place no one would ever think to look, in a child's book, in a remote cabin, waiting for the right person to find it. But there was one last line in the coded message, a line that made her gasp. WITMOREISNOTSAFE, the judge, her father. He was in danger. "Joshua!" she cried, shaking him awake. "Joshua, wake up!" He opened his eyes, hazy with fever. She thrust the affidavit in front of him. "Look, I found it. It was in the book. It's the evidence. It's a confession." He struggled to sit up, his eyes focusing on the paper. He read it, his face hardening into a mask of stone. The fever, the pain, it all seemed to burn away, replaced by a cold, lethal fury. "Caleb Patterson," he breathed, "the blacksmith. He was our friend." "There's more," she said, her voice trembling. "The message in the book. It says my father isn't safe. The Hartleys, they must know he's behind this. They'll go after him." Joshua was already on his feet, pulling the cinch tight on his saddle. The plan had changed. Cheyenne could wait. "They won't be expecting us to come back," he said, his voice a low growl. "They think we're running. They're wrong." They were riding back into the lion's den, back to Prosperity Creek. They weren't running to save themselves anymore. They were riding to save her father. They rode into Prosperity Creek under the cover of a moonless night, two ghosts returning to a town that wanted them dead. They didn't go down the main street. Joshua led them through back alleys and shadowed pastures, moving with a predator's silence. He knew this town, every inch of it. He knew its secrets. They tethered the animals in a thicket behind the church and crept through the graveyard, the tombstones like silent, watching sentinels. The judge's house was dark, every window a black, vacant eye. But something was wrong. The front gate, usually latched, was slightly ajar. "Wait here," Joshua whispered, pressing her into the shadows of a large oak tree. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you take my horse, you ride for Cheyenne, and you don't look back. You give that affidavit to the governor yourself. Promise me." "Joshua, no." "Promise me, Charlotte," he hissed, his grip tight on her arm. "I promise," she whispered. He slipped away, a shadow melting into other shadows. The 10 minutes that followed were the longest of Charlotte's life. Every rustle of leaves was an enemy. Every distant dog barked a warning. She counted the seconds, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. 5 minutes. 7. 9. Just as she was about to panic, he reappeared, his face grim. He's not there. The house is empty. But there's a struggle. A chair knocked over. A lamp on the floor. "His office," she breathed. "At the courthouse. He sometimes works there late." "It's a trap, Charlotte." "I know," she said, "but he's my father." The courthouse stood at the end of the main street, a dark, imposing silhouette against the starry sky. A single light burned in the window of the judge's office on the second floor. It was a beacon, an allure. "They'll have watchers," Joshua said, scanning the rooftops of the opposite buildings. "At least 2. One on the Mercantile, one on the hotel. We'll never make it across the street." He looked around, his eyes piercing the darkness. He was thinking, calculating. Then his gaze fell on the livery stable at the far end of the street. "I have an idea," he said, "but it's crazy." His plan was insane. It was suicidal, but it was the only chance they had. He explained it in quick, hushed tones. He pointed to a stack of hay bales behind the livery, a pile of dry tinder just waiting for a spark. "Fire is the best distraction," he said. "When they see the livery go up, everyone will come running. The watchers on the roofs, Hartley's men, the whole town. In the confusion, we can get across the street to the courthouse." "But the horses," she started to say. "I'll get them out first," he said. "I'll start a small fire, create smoke, stampede them out the back. Then I'll light the whole damn thing. You wait for the church bell to start ringing. That's the fire alarm. When it does, you run. You run straight for the side door of the courthouse. I'll meet you there." "It's too dangerous." "It's the only way," he said, his green eyes boring into hers. He took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "Be brave, Charlotte." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness toward the livery. She waited, her body coiled like a spring. The silence of the town was deafening. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then she saw it, a faint orange flicker from the back of the livery. A moment later, the sound of panicked whinnying and the thunder of hooves as the horses were freed. And then the world exploded in light. A sheet of flame erupted from the livery, roaring into the night sky, turning darkness into a terrifying, flickering day. Almost immediately, a man on the roof of the hotel shouted in alarm. Then the frantic, clanging toll of the church bell began to ring. That was her signal. Charlotte took a deep breath and ran. She burst from the shadows of the graveyard, her legs pumping, her lungs burning. She flew across the main street, the ground lit by the hellish glow of the fire. Shouts echoed around her as people poured out of the saloon in their homes. No one even noticed the lone woman sprinting through the chaos. She reached the side door of the courthouse, her hand fumbling for the knob. It was locked. Panic seized her. Had she been too late? Suddenly, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, dragging her back into the shadows of the alley. She opened her mouth to scream, but then she heard Joshua's voice in her ear. "Shh, it's me." He had made it. His face was smudged with soot, and he smelled of smoke, but he was there. He produced a set of slender metal tools. "Your father taught me more than just the law," he whispered, kneeling by the lock. A few deft movements, a soft click, and the door swung open. They slipped inside into the silent, tomb-like darkness of the courthouse. The only light came from the red glow of the fire outside. casting long, dancing shadows down the hallway. They could hear the town in an uproar, the shouts and clang of the bell a perfect cover for their entry. They moved up the main staircase, their steps silent on the marble floor. At the top, a long hallway stretched toward the judge's chambers. The door was closed, but a sliver of yellow lamplight seeped from underneath it. Joshua put a finger to his lips, then drew his pistol. He motioned for her to stay back, then crept toward the door. He pressed his ear against the thick oak, listening. The voice that came from inside was not her father's. It was the oily, arrogant voice of the man who had started it all. The patriarch, Old Man Hartley. "It's over, Judge," Hartley's voice sneered. "Your marshal is dead or running, your daughter is a stable hands whore, and your land, with all its shiny little secrets, is mine. You have nothing left." There was a pause, then her father's voice, tired but unbroken. "You'll never get away with this, Hartley. The law will catch up to you." Hartley laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "The law? Judge, I am the law in this town. I bought it, fair and square. Now, for the last time, where is the full geological survey? The one that shows all the silver veins?" "I'll die before I tell you," the judge said. "I know," Hartley said, his voice dropping. "That was always the plan." There was the distinct metallic click of a pistol hammer being cocked. Joshua didn't wait. He kicked the door. The lock splintered, the door flying open with a deafening crash. Joshua lunged into the room, his pistol up. Old Man Hartley stood over the judge, who was tied to his own chair. Hartley had a gun pressed to her father's temple. Two of his hired thugs were in the room as well, and they spun around, reaching for their weapons. "Drop it, Marshal!" Hartley snarled, pressing the gun harder against the judge's head. "Or your old friend gets it first." Joshua froze, his face a mask of fury. It was a standoff. Charlotte had hung back in the doorway, her heart in her throat. Hartley and his men were focused on Joshua. They hadn't even seen her. In her hand, she still clutched the small pistol Joshua had given her. Her hands were sweating, but her mind was ice cold. Breathe out. Squeeze. She raised the gun, just as he had taught her. She didn't aim for Hartley. He was too close to her father. She aimed for the thug on the right, the bigger of the two. She fired. The explosion was deafening. The thug cried out and staggered back, clutching his leg, his gun clattering to the floor. The momentary distraction was all Joshua needed. In that split second, as all eyes turned to her, he fired twice. Two precise, economical shots. The second thug dropped like a stone. Old Man Hartley grunted, the gun falling from his hand as he clutched a sudden red stain blooming on his shoulder. It was over in 3 seconds. Joshua was across the room in a flash, kicking the guns away and cutting her father free. The judge stumbled to his feet, rubbing his wrists, his eyes finding Charlotte's in the doorway. The look on his face was a mixture of terror, pride, and overwhelming relief. "Charlotte," he breathed, but it wasn't over. Old Man Hartley, clutching his wounded arm, staggered back toward the window, his face contorted with rage and pain. "You think you've won?" he spat, blood flecking his lips. "This town is still mine. The fire will be out in an hour. My men still hold every road. You'll never leave here alive." He fumbled at his belt with his good hand, pulling out a small, snub-nosed Derringer he had kept hidden. He aimed it not at Joshua, not at the judge, but at Charlotte. "If I'm going down," he screamed, "I'm taking her with me." Her father cried out her name. Joshua started to move, but they were too late. Hartley pulled the trigger. There was a flash, a bang. Charlotte felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through her side. The force of it threw her back against the doorframe. The world tilted, the lamplight blurring into a smear of yellow. She felt her knees buckle, and the last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Joshua's face, his eyes wide with horror as he screamed her name. The world came back in pieces. The smell of antiseptic, the soft feel of clean sheets, the low murmur of voices. Charlotte opened her eyes. She was in her own bed, in her father's house. Sunlight streamed through the window. For a moment she thought it had all been a nightmare. Then she tried to move, and the sharp pulling pain in her side reminded her it was real. Her father was sitting in a chair by her bed, his face etched with worry. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. When he saw her eyes were open, He let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. "Charlotte," he whispered. "The doctor said." He said the bullet passed clean through. "You were lucky." "Hartley?" she managed to ask, her voice a dry rasp. "Dead," the judge said, his voice flat. "After he shot you, Joshua, he didn't kill him. He subdued him. But when the townsfolk saw what he had done, when they saw the livery burning and realized the Hartleys were behind it all, they formed their own kind of justice. The new marshal from Cheyenne found him hanging from the courthouse flagpole this morning. The rest of the story came out in a rush. With Hartley dead and the affidavit as proof, his entire empire had crumbled overnight. Caleb, the blacksmith, had given a full confession, corroborating every detail. The town, free from the Hartley's grip for the first time in a decade, was slowly starting to breathe again. "It's over," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over." He took her hand, his own trembling slightly. "Charlotte, I am so sorry. For everything. I was trying to protect you, but my pride, my foolish plan, it almost got you killed." Tears streamed down his weathered face. "Can you ever forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive," she whispered, squeezing his hand. She rested for 2 days, drifting in and out of a medicated sleep. Her mother fussed over her, bringing her broth and cool cloths for her head, her face a mask of quiet gratitude. The town had been saved. Her daughter was alive. It was enough. On the 3rd day, she felt strong enough to sit up. And the first question she asked was, "Where is Joshua?" Her father's face grew somber. "He's gone, Charlotte." Her heart plummeted. "Gone? Gone where?" "He left this morning, rode out before sunrise. He said his work here was done. The territory has reinstated him. He's a marshal again. They're sending him to Arizona." The judge paused. He said to tell you he was grateful for the reading lessons." Charlotte felt a hollow ache spread through her chest, an emptiness that had nothing to do with her wound. He was gone. Just like that. The soldier, the ghost from the past, had completed his mission and moved on. The quiet man who taught her how to shoot and the clumsy student who learned his letters at her table. He was just a memory now. She sank back against the pillows, turning her face to the window. The town of Prosperity Creek was out there, safe and sound. She was back in her fine house in her silk nightgown. Everything was as it should be. So why did it feel like she had lost everything that mattered? A week later, she was strong enough to walk in the garden. The world seemed too quiet, too tame. She missed the wild prairie wind. She missed the smell of wood smoke and coffee in the small cabin. She missed the low, steady sound of his voice as they sat by the fire. Her father found her there. "The Reverend Walsh came by," he said gently. "He mentioned that the families, the ones you were teaching, they've been asking after you. They want to know when lessons will start again." The words were a lifeline, a purpose. The school, their school. "Tell them Sunday," she said, a flicker of the old fire returning to her eyes. "Lessons will be on Sunday, in the church." That Sunday, the church was full, not just with the children, but with their parents too. The blacksmith, the storekeeper, farmers, and ranch hands. They came to learn, but they also came to pay their respects to the woman who had helped save their town. As she stood before them, slate in hand, she felt a sense of peace settle over her for the first time since she'd woken up. This was her purpose now. This was the future she and Joshua had talked about. She would build it, even if she had to build it alone. After the lesson, as she was packing away the slates, a small girl, Anna Kowalski, tugged on her dress. "For you, teacher," she said, and handed Charlotte a folded piece of paper. Charlotte opened it. Inside, in the slow, careful letters she knew so well, was a short message. A is for always. J is for Joshua. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd at the back of the church. And there he was. He was leaning against the back wall, no longer dressed in the rough clothes of a stable hand, but in a simple, clean suit. His arm was in a sling, but he was standing tall. And he was smiling that slow, transformative smile that made her heart ache. He hadn't left. He had been waiting for her to choose. She walked toward him, the crowd parting for her as if by instinct. She didn't run. She walked with a steady, certain stride. She stopped a foot in front of him, the piece of paper clutched in her hand. "I thought you were going to Arizona," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was," he said, his green eyes holding hers, "but I realized I left something important behind." "What was that?" she asked. "My wife," he said. He stepped forward and, for the first time, he kissed her. Not on the knuckles, not as an ally, but on the lips. It wasn't the kiss of a bodyguard or a stranger, but the kiss of a man who had found his way home. The people in the church were silent for a moment, and then someone started to clap. Soon the whole room was filled with applause. They weren't just clapping for a kiss. They were clapping for the end of a war, for the quiet, stable hand who was a hero, for the judge's proud daughter who had saved them all, for the beginning of a new story, their story, built not on a lie or a law, but on a love that had been forged in fire and tested by death. From punishment, they had found their purpose. From a desperate plan, they had found a promise. And in the heart of Prosperity Creek, the marshal and the school teacher built a life far richer than any silver mine. A life filled with books and laughter, and a love that was as strong and as boundless as the prairie itself. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, and you want to hear more tales that prove the most unbelievable stories are often the truest, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't regret it.